Oh, okay.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Okay, Carm, now you're on. Thank you.
I'm delighted to introduce Todd. Though I don't think he needs much of an introduction, he's certainly well known to the public, many times on the CBC gardening programs. For anyone here tonight, though, that does not know Todd, he graduated from Memorial University with a master's degree in plant ecology. He's research horticulturist at the Botanical Garden, and he was one of the founding members of our society.
Oh, Carm, Carm. Carmel, can you unmute yourself?
I'm on.
Okay, try again.
Start again.
Yeah, so sorry.
Sorry, guys.
No, you can just pick up where you left off. That's
Okay.
great. Okay.
Todd is a member of the administrative committee of the North American Rock Garden Society and president of our local chapter. He has a keen interest in orchids, and I think at one time was president of the Newfoundland Orchid Society. Todd is the author of 9 books. I will not name all 9, but the ones which have been a wonderful reference for us are Wildflowers of Nova Scotia, Wildflowers of New Brunswick, Wildflowers and Ferns of Newfoundland and Labrador, Wildflowers of Fogo and the Change Islands, Trees and Shrubs of Maritimes, and Trees and Shrubs of Newfoundland and Labrador. And by the way, any of Todd's books would make a wonderful Christmas gift for a family member or friend. Todd is an avid bird watcher and a wonderful photographer, and he travels extensively. Finally, I'd like to say, every time I needed someone to lead a walk or give a talk, Todd was always so incredibly helpful, and he never turned me down. Our last walk for the season was a tree walk at Boring Park, and it was the most attended of our walks for the season. It's always exciting to be in the company of Todd. He has a wonderful sense of humor, and he makes learning for all of us so much fun. Take it from there, Todd.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Carm.
Okay.
I'm almost embarrassed here. Okay, let's see if I can do this. It's always a challenge for me to get everything lined up here. There we go. Let's see. As long as my computer doesn't act up, which it sometimes does. Okay, slideshow. All right, so is everyone seeing the screen okay? I'm going to assume yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. That's all I want. Just want to make sure. All right, so good evening, everyone. So last June, the last 10 days of June, I was invited to be a co-leader for the North American Rock Garden Society's tour to Switzerland. So it was a great opportunity. I'd never been to Switzerland before. They were wondering, do you know the plants of Switzerland? It's like, yeah, sort of, because a lot of them I do grow. But as it turns out, as we were wandering around this area, I quickly discovered that a lot of these plants grow in Newfoundland. So you're going to see a number of familiar faces and or closely related plants to plants that we have here in Newfoundland. So the Bernese Oberland area of Switzerland is close to the Italian border. It's in sort of the southern part, sort of southwestern portion, I should say, of Switzerland, close to the Italian border. It's all limestone. Okay, so this is why we're going to see some familiar faces from our limestone barrens, because it seems like a lot of plants from limestone areas end up, certainly in the northern hemisphere, end up co-occurring in different areas, even though they're the same species. They may be found in widely separated areas. So a little bit about the area of this part where we stay to. The place we stay is called Wengen, and there's no cars. The only way to get into Wengen is by gondola or by train. As much as there's some local traffic, essentially for tourists, the only way you can get there is by train or by gondola. And every day when we went for our walks, we had to hop on a train or we had to hop on a gondola to get to where we wanted to go. But the background that you see there is essentially what we saw every day for the 10 days. And we were very fortunate that it only rained one day the whole time we were there, and that was only for a couple of hours. So we actually did absolutely fantastic from a weather perspective. So this was the Hotel Bellevue where we stayed. The view on the other side of the hotel is absolutely spectacular. You'll see that in a moment. Being a sort of a freebie for me, if you can see my mouse, my room was right down in this corner. So I didn't have much of a view. I basically just sort of looked out in the back of the building. But, you know, we're really only here to sleep most of the day. You know, we're up at 7 in the morning, had our breakfast, usually on the road by 8:30 or so. And we never got back until probably around 5:30 in the evening. We just take a bag lunch with us and we go hiking and walking all day long. It's amazing. So this is the view from the other side of the hotel. I should note that this area is also UNESCO World Heritage Site as well. So I guess it's based upon the mountains that are in this area. There are 73 waterfalls within this relatively small area of Switzerland. Here's a map of the area, and I'm going to keep reiterating back to this map again, just to keep you grounded as to where we are each day. So the main population, I guess, the main towns, we'll say, or the closest town to this would have been a place called Interlaken, and we did go there for a day. And the next closest large city, that would be Bern. Okay, but Bern was still probably a couple of hours away. So we stayed in Wengen, and as I mentioned, Wengen's only accessible by train or by gondola. And the dashed line that you see on the map here is actually the train track, and that takes you primarily from Wengen to Kleine Scheidegg up here in the top, and then on down to this area here, which is called Grindelwald. And Grindelwald is sort of the Banff of this area. Lots of tourist traffic in that particular area. All the red lines you see here, those are all footpaths, and the dashed lines are the gondolas. Okay, so some days we took the gondola from Wengen to Mannlichen. Other days we would have taken the train up to Kleine Scheidegg or to wherever, okay? And I'll keep coming back to this map time and time again. So day one, we took the train to a place called Kleine Scheidegg. And so this being our first day, we're all very excited to be in the area. Wengen itself, as you can see here in the sign, is at 1,274 meters above sea level. So we were already over a kilometer high, but we're still basically surrounded by fairly large forests in this particular area itself. Here's the train. We got to know this train very well. We basically use this train every day at some point, whether we're going down into the valley or whether we're going higher up into the mountains. But the train system in Switzerland is brilliant. If they say the train's going to arrive at 10:05, it's going to arrive at 10:05. There was one day that the conductor, so to speak, at the train station was very apologetic because the train was 3 minutes delayed. Okay, so the Swiss people, they got it down to a science. There's probably a reason why there's a lot of Swiss watches out there. Okay, so this is Kleine Scheidegg right here. What you're seeing down the valley here is a hotel. And the view where I'm standing to now is one of two cafes. And the great thing about Switzerland, no matter where you go, there's always a nice cafe that you can go in, get a fancy coffee, get a nice dessert type of thing. I had apple strudel practically every single day while I was there, just to see the differences between point A and point B as far as what their apple strudels tasted like. But in this picture right here, if you see my mouse, up right here, this is a glacier. This is called the Jungfrau. And later on one of the days, we actually took a train from the Kleine Scheidegg through the middle of this mountain, 45-minute train ride to come out on the top of the mountain where this glacier is located. Okay. Now, my co-leader, she's been to this area for like the past 20 years. She's seen a dramatic reduction in the number of the size of the glaciers. And they're suspecting that within the next 20 years, all the glaciers will be gone in this area. So, climate change is having a major, major impact in this particular area. It's rather sad, actually, when you think about it. So this is a view from the Kleine Scheidegg looking down into the neighboring valley, And at the very bottom there is Grindelwald. Okay, and we do eventually end up there. I'm not sure which day it is, but one of the days we end up going down to Grindelwald just to sort of check it out. So just to start off, as soon as we got off the train in Kleine Scheidegg, we had all these sort of beautiful meadows, alpine meadows, subalpine meadows, and it was just a ride of color. I mean, there's lots of flowers. All the purple you see there are dactylorhiza orchids, including the same species that we have here, as it should happen. But the main thing that we were really catching our eyes on the very first day were all the gentians, all the spring flowering gentians. And that intense blue, I mean, it just really, really grabs at you as you're wandering around. And a number of these plants that I'm going to show you, we end up seeing every day. I mean, the gentians were an everyday occurrence. But in other areas, we'd always pick up another, dozen or half a dozen new plants. Okay, so by the end of the trip, we had like 300 or 400 different species of plants that we had seen. In bloom. Okay, we saw lots of plants that were in bud or, just the plants themselves, but we saw lots of things in bloom. So this one right here, you're seeing here now is Gentiana verna. It's one of the smaller of the intense blue gentians. This is Acaulis and Gentiana clusii. So Acaulis and clusii, very similar. Clusii just being a little bit more of a purpley blue, not quite as intense as what Acaulis would be. Campanula barbata on the left. In the middle, a face familiar to us, Bartzia alpina, the alpine velvet bells. So any of us have been up on the Northern Peninsula and the limestone barrens, especially in the Cape Norman area, you will have seen this plant, okay? It's a hemiparasitic plant. So it basically taps into neighboring plants, usually grasses, excuse me, and steals a little bit of their photosynthetic sugars, we'll say, okay? So it's sort of like your neighbor that will borrow a cup of sugar, but never return it, okay? So it's all give, and or I should say, all take, and never give. On the right-hand side is Pulsatilla alpina, which we grow here in the botanical gardens. In fact, our specimen here will have probably around 25 to 30 flowers on it. In the wild, we very rarely saw plants with more than 3 or 4 flowers on them. So we seem to be doing something right here in the garden in regards to growing that particular plant. Beautiful violet. This is Viola calcarata. And you can see where it looks more like a pansy compared to the violets that we have native here. So it probably is an ancestor to some of the more modern day violas that you can buy in the garden centers. Helianthemum nummularium was the yellow flower. Mutilina purpurea used to be a ligusticum, okay? It was a lovage, but they've now moved it into its own genus called Mutilina. But it looks like a very feathery leaved version of a lovage with very, very pale pink flowers. So there's a closer view there. So the flowers are, typical umbellifer with these little white lacy type flowers, but the flowers open palest of pink, and then as they age, they get a little bit darker. Phytuma orbiculaire is the blue. That's related to Campanulas, okay? So it's in the bellflower family. And the plant on the right is another Phytuma called spicatum. You can't see much reference there to a bellflower, but they're actually, if you see the flowers very, very close up, you can see that just a lot of their structure does look very similar to a Campanula. And Switzerland is probably the home to the greatest diversity of Phytumas. We end up seeing, I think, 8 to 10 species while we were there. The differences between them are very subtle. It's more based on foliage than it is the flowers. The flowers for most, especially the blue ones, all look very, very similar. There's a closer view there, Phytuma orbiculaire. And then on the hillsides, keeping in mind, this is all limestone. On the hillsides, it was all Rhododendron ferruginum. And we don't think about rhododendrons being on limestone. However, we know here and look locally here in Newfoundland that Rhododendron lapponicum often grows on the limestone barrens, or it grows on serpentine. So it can certainly tolerate alkaline or higher pH soils. So Rhododendron ferruginum falls in that same category. It's a rhododendron that actually performs better with a higher pH soil as opposed to being highly acidic. And essentially it fulfills the same role, excuse me, in the subalpine zones as what Calmia angustifolia does here. And from a distance, it looks like sheep laurel, Okay, it's not until you see it closer up you can start to see, oh yeah, it really is a rhododendron, albeit a small flowered one. But here on the close up, you can see it truly is a little rhododendron. And we grow that one here at the Botanical Garden. It does quite well in our Newfoundland's conditions. A lot of orchids. We saw a lot of orchids on this trip. Dactylorhiza, Fuchsii on the left, Myalis, our native, I say our native one, our introduced one here in the Greater St. John's area. And what used to be Coeloglossum viride, which is now Dactylorhiza viride, the frog orchid. Again, we'd be familiar with that one from the limestone barrens here in Newfoundland. So that was a familiar face for me. But not all the orchids were familiar. This is Gymnodenia, Conopsia, and Nigratella nigra. The Nigratella nigra had the most spectacular vanilla fragrance. So anyone who's been up on the Northern Peninsula here and have seen the vanilla scented orchid, and you know how nicely fragrant that is, the Nigratella has basically the same fragrance. Very, very strong vanilla fragrance to it. We also saw Transcenera globosa, another orchid. I wasn't familiar. It was the first time I ever seen that one. And then we had Pseudorchis straminea. Now, you look at that and you say, it's a vanilla scented orchid. It's a Newfoundland orchid. And at one time, ours was the same genus or same species as this, but I've noticed now they've split it. So ours is now Pseudorchis albida, which occurs in Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, and Scandinavia, whereas the populations throughout the Alps and the Pyrenees are now called Pseudorchis straminea. And I can tell you the fragrance on this one is more like cloves as opposed to vanilla. So there is certainly a difference in the smell. However, looking at the flowers, they look very, very similar to our vanilla scented orchid. Okay, so that was day one. We saw lots of other flowers, but you know, I mean, I could just do the whole talk just on day one. Excuse me. Okay, on day two, we left from Wengen and we took a gondola up to a place called the Mannlichen. So that's just sort of to the left and a little bit higher up. And from there, we took trail number 35, if you can see that on your screen. Here we go, I got my mouse. So we took the gondola to here. We took trail 35 into 34 and hiked back to the Kleine Scheidegg and then took the train back down to Wengen again. So here's the gondola. It was amazing how steep these things are. And once you got to the top, this was the gondola station at Mannlichen. And we didn't go over this mountain, but basically walked around the side of this mountain to the base of this higher mountain here in the background. And another view just of the countryside here. So you can see in the valleys, it's well forested, primarily Norway spruce for the most part, but we were up into the Alpine zone pretty much every day. Another view there, and except the mountains are just absolutely spectacular. And even though it looks fairly green, once you get there and start wandering, there's lots of flowers, lots of color. Here we go on the slopes again. All the pink that we see was more of the rhododendron ferruginum. And lots of meadows again, with lots of orchids, again, primarily Dactylorhiza. It was just predominant. It was just pretty much everywhere. And here's what you can see close up. So I don't know how many species of flowers are in this one little view alone, but I can certainly see at least 6 or 7 species there. So, I mean, it was sort of heartbreaking to step out into the meadows. So luckily there were trails. And they sort of encourage people to stay on the trails as much as possible because you don't want to be destroying them. You know, they get thousands and thousands of visitors a year and everybody start walking across the meadows here, it will get degraded pretty quickly. So even though there were 25 of us on our tour, we pretty much stuck to the trails for the most part. All the flowers grew right next to the trails. You didn't really need to step into the meadows at all in order to see the plants close up. So in the meadows, we had Geranium sylvaticum, were very, very common. Lots of Myosotis alpestris, the forget-me-not, alpine forget-me-not. And a plant that used to be called Anemone narcissiflorum has now been reclassified as Anemonastrum narcissiflorum. So it sort of looks like a narcissus, okay, which is hence the narcissiflorum, which means narcissus flowered. So it's sort of like a narcissus that you would grow as a bulb, but in this case, it is an anemone. I grow this one in my own garden. It grows fantastically well in Newfoundland. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Pedicularis. So we have a couple of those here in Newfoundland. couple that are introduced, a couple that are native. The native ones are quite rare. Actually, the introduced ones are not that common either. This one is Particularis verticillata. But over here on the right is Trollius europaeus. And a lot of us grow that one as a garden plant. In fact, as a heritage plant in Newfoundland. So it was interesting to see some of the plants that we grow in our gardens actually growing in the wild. And it really gives you a better appreciation of how these plants want to grow and where they want to grow. So this Trollius, quite happy, way above the tree line, very, very hardy. It's covered by snow for 6, 7, 8 months of the year, which it is here in Newfoundland. So it's not surprising this plant does so well in our climate. Ranunculus aconitifolius. So anyone who's been up to Botanical Garden here, you may be familiar with a plant that we call the Fair Maids of France. And the Fair Maids of France is growing in our heritage garden, and it's essentially a double-flowered version of this particular species. Actually, the single-flowered version is quite lovely in itself, and it's the first time I'd ever seen the single-flowered version, so it was rather nice to see it. Very, very common plant, quite a robust plant, but it's basically a white buttercup. Okay, and there's a closer view here of the flowers. On the right is Hypocaris uniflora, which is like a cat's ear. We have a cat's ear here in Newfoundland introduced, which is a different species. And on the left, Astragalus alpinus. It's a plant that grows up in Burnt Cape. Grows throughout Labrador too, as I found out on my most recent trip up there. Lotus alpinus and Geum montanum. Geum montana, I grow in my own garden here. So another plant. So, I mean, I was quite familiar, even though I'd never been this area before, I was familiar with a lot of the plants because we're either growing them here at the Botanical Garden or I'm growing them personally in my own garden. So again, like I said, just gave me a better appreciation of the various plants that I'm growing. On the rocky slopes, on the scree slopes, whereas Doronicum grandiflorum, which is essentially a leopard's bane, and Dryas octopetala. So very similar to our Dryas integrifolia, except for the fact that this is an evergreen species, okay? Our integrifolia will lose its leaves. The leaves are marcescent. They dry up, remain attached to the plant, but they dry up in the winter, whereas Dryas octopetala stays green all year round. Here's a closer view of the Dryas octopetala. So it's a white mountain avens. The flowers are very, very similar to our integrifolia. Alchemilla alpina. We grow that one here in the Botanical Garden, and growing right next to it here was Saxifraga paniculata. Over here on the right is more Saxifraga paniculata, the encrusted saxifrage. Another plant that we'll be familiar with. Anyone who's been up on the Northern Peninsula has probably stumbled into this plant at some point. Very, very wide distributional range. On the right here is Saxifraga aspera, and on the left is Linaria alpina. So it's a toadflax, very pretty toadflax, as it turns out. A lot of saxifrages throughout the Swiss Alps. We're going to see more and more species as we go along. Here's a closer view here of the Linaria alpina. In some of the shady nooks, there was Viola biflora, always has 2 flowers per stem. And here it is again, here sort of growing up in the shade of the rocks. And often growing side by side with it was Androsace camajasme. Okay, and this is an interesting plant because when the flowers first open, the center is yellow. And it's basically a cue to pollinators, come to visit me, I have nectar for you. Once they've been visited and they've been pollinated, the center turns red or turns pink. So then the pollinators don't have to worry about it anymore. They can just concentrate their efforts on those flowers which haven't been visited yet, that they might hopefully bring about pollination. Hornugia alpina, it's a Brassicaceae plant in the mustard family. And this is a little tiny little bulbous plant called Gagia serotina. Another ranunculus, another white ranunculus. These white buttercups are just the most exquisite flowers. You know, we think of buttercups being as old, these weedy old things in our gardens. But, you know, once you get up into the alpine zone, you come across these alpine species of buttercup. So many of them are white. And it just seems to bring a whole different character to a plant that we otherwise think of as being so mundane. So this is Ranunculus alpestris with pristine white flowers. And here's a natural little rock garden. It's just a rocky outcrop along the trail, all filled with these little tiny little white daisies called Leucanthemopsis alpina. I've never seen it in cultivation. I think it'd be a beautiful plant to grow as a rock garden plant. Arabis alpina, we're familiar with that one. It's a Newfoundland native as well. On the right is Aster bilidiastrum. So it's the aster that looks like an English daisy. Okay, so that's the Bellis perennis, the English daisy. So Aster bilidiastrum. There's a closer view there of the rock cress, the Arabis alpina. We had a few primroses. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the primroses were finished. We were a bit late in the season for them, but in some of the shadier areas where they were a bit later, the snow was a bit later before it melted, we found Primula farinosa, which is very similar to our Laurentiana, and we had Primula hirsuta. Probably the best plant on that second day was to find the Soldanella alpina, the alpine fringe bell. And it's what we call a snowbed species. So it grows right where the late lying snows are. It blooms within a couple of days of the snow melt, and then it's gone for the rest of the year. Okay, basically just sticks around as foliage. So you have to be in the right place at the right time in the right week in order to see it in bloom. And we thought we were going to miss it, but we happened to find one little shady nook where there was still a little bit of late lying snow, and sure enough, the Soldanella alpinas were at their glory there. Just an exquisite plant. It's related actually to primroses. It's in the primrose family. We actually found a white one too, which was even more special. Seems like whenever you find a white alba form of a plant, you know, people go goo goo gaga over that. But we also found one that was almost a reddish color, sort of a reddish pink, which I thought was actually more attractive than the white one. And some of the little wet seepages, we had Pinguicula alpina in white, and our familiar Pinguicula vulgaris. So that's the butterworts. Okay, it's a little insectivorous plant. There's a closer view there of the Pinguicula alpina and a closer view there of Pinguicula vulgaris. Okay, day 3, we went to the schiltthorn. And the schiltthorn is actually sort of off to the right of the screen here. Okay, you can see Winterregg. Okay, so we had to take the train and then a gondola to Winterregg, and then from there we took another train and then another gondola until we got to the schiltthorn. Okay, so it was a little bit beyond the overall Wengen area, we'll say, but still, you know, easy to get there within about an hour of various modes of transportation. And what's famous about the schiltthorn is it was the site of a James Bond movie in 1969. Okay, so the whole area in the movie, this area, this building blew up. Okay, but right now, of course, the building's still there. It was all just animation, but everything's the James Bond theme. Okay, now unfortunately, this day was a day that the cloud level was quite low, so we didn't really have great views of the mountains, even though we're quite high up in this particular spot. Very, very wind blown. You know, it was quite breezy in this particular spot as well. But everything's a 007. So you go inside the restaurant, and it was a revolving restaurant. So the main part here is not revolving. It's just that you sort of step down and you had this sort of a circumference circle. And that was a portion that kept circling. Okay. So it was interesting. Great place to have a coffee and have another apple strudel while we're waiting. And then we went outside and started wandering around in the area. So this is the view. You step out of the back. You had this gorgeous view. But unfortunately, we were up into the clouds that particular day, way above the tree line in this case, actually almost above where most plants were growing. But there were a few very, very special plants in this area. Here's another saxifraga, Saxifraga exorata. It's like a mossy saxifrage, similar to our Saxifraga cespitosa that's native on the Northern Peninsula. This is Gallium anisophyllum. So it's a bed straw. It's a very pale yellow creeping bedstraw. But the only place you're going to find this is way, way, way above the tree line. So what was great about this is that we'd never get to these areas. It's just too hard a hike to get there. But by taking the gondolas, you just sort of step off the gondola and there they are. I mean, it's just absolutely brilliant. Another very, very special plant in this area was Androcerae alpina. So you can see here, this is like a rocky outcrop. And here it's just right in the cracks with these little patches of white or patches of pale pink. And that's where this plant would grow. It was the most amazing how they could get root in such a minuscule amount of soil. There's a closer view there of the flowers. So these are actually related to primroses as well. So we saw they were typically pink, but again, we found one that was pure white. Saxifraga oppositifolia. Okay, so that's a plant near and dear to our hearts here. Again, a plant very hard for us to see in bloom because he bloomed so early on the Northern Peninsula before most of us decide to go up there. The same thing here in Switzerland. We never expected to see this in bloom. It's only because we're so high up in elevation and there were still snow beds around us that we're lucky enough to find a Saxifraga, the Purple Mountain saxifrage, still in bloom. Another very special plant in this area was Nokia rotundifolia. It's a member of the mustard family. Very highly fragrant. It's amazing. I should have put a coin here. These plants, these rosettes are only about the size of a loonie. Okay, so they're pretty small, but highly, highly fragrant. I guess they have to have some way to attract a pollinator. But you can see it's basically a very, very pale, mauvey colored mustard. And probably the creme de la creme is yet another white flowered buttercup, Ranunculus glacialis, the glacier buttercup. And they were growing on these very, very steep, rocky limestone cliffs. What's interesting about this plant is that the flowers open white, but as they age, they turn pink. And we don't think about buttercups turning pink. So here's a plant when it first opens up, it's beautiful, very white flowers, quite a large yellow center, real bullseye for any bumblebees or flies that happen to be going by. Another view there. It's just an exquisite, and everybody wants to be able to grow this plant, but it's virtually impossible to grow in cultivation because it cannot tolerate any amount of heat at all. And here it is after the flowers start to fade. And so the flowers go from white and they turn to pink. Okay, and so you can see side by side, a freshly opened flower next to a plant that's been in bloom for probably a week or two. So for me, this was probably amongst certainly in the top 10 of plants that I wanted to see on this trip. Now, winter rag itself, once we descended back down, winter rag was basically back into Norway spruce forest. So we're now looking more at forest species, okay, woodland species, as opposed to alpine species. But we came down out of the clouds back into the clear blue skies again. So here we were starting to see more shade-loving plants that we might grow in our own shade gardens here in Newfoundland. This campanula is rhomboidalis, the aquilegia, the columbine is aquilegia atrata, and then there was Melampyrum sylvaticum, one of the cow wheat, with little paired yellow flowers. It's another hemiparasitic plant. And then in the forest, in the darker spots, was Neotia nittis avis. Okay, this is well, not really saprophytic. I'm not sure what the term is these days they use, but basically it's an orchid that parasitizes fungus. Okay, so this orchid has no chlorophyll of its own. Okay, so it's sort of like the corallorizas that we have here in Newfoundland. So this is, they call it the bird's nest orchid, Neotia nittis avis, and we also had Neotia ovata, one of the tway blades. And close-up of the flowers and that is very similar to the tway blades that we have here in Newfoundland, except for the fact that it produces a very long, narrow spike of flowers, as opposed to a very, very short, congested one like the tway blades do here. But the floral structure is very similar. Okay, day 4. So now we took the train back up to the Kleine Scheidegg up here. So that's sort of the melting pot for a lot of the trails. And we walked then down over the hill to Vingernalpt right here, and then to Almed down here. So we hiked from here on down the hillside to Almed, then we hopped back on the train and came back down to Wengen. So that would take us from the Alpine meadows right down back into the shady coniferous forest. So this is up in the Vingernalpt area. You can see there are some little patches of trees here and there. That, you know, but we're sort of in that cusp between the alpine and the forested areas, but lots of open meadows, lots of cows, lots of banging of bells around their necks. You know, that was the classic sound you heard everywhere when you were in the Swiss Alps. And then as if you were sort of looking back up at the mountains from the Vingernalpt. And one never got sick of looking at the mountains, I can assure you. So gentiana, this is the yellow gentian, Gentiana lutea, probably one of the largest gentians around. A big robust plant can reach a couple of feet in height. And you look at it for a long time, probably not even think it was being a gentian at all, to tell you the truth. But I mean, just to see these gentians with that beautiful backdrop, it was just stunning. Centaurea, one of the knapweeds, Centaurea phrygia, Astrantia major, which is the masterwort. We grow that here in the botanical garden. And then it was Veratrum album. This is in the lily family. Quite a large plant with sort of greenish yellow flowers. There's a closer view there. So you had these beautiful, you know, even though they're sort of greenish in color, they still made quite an impact. And they're quite large. Most of these will grow several feet tall. Neotia, yes, I got it right the first time. Ustulata. No, this is just called the burnt tip orchid. It's a lot easier to say. And Aquilegia alpina were two new plants that we saw on this day. Gypsophila repens, that's a creeping baby's breath. We grow that here in the garden. And Atocian rupestri. So these two plants look very, very similar to each other, and they're closely related. Adenostylus alliare. It's a Asteraceae plant, grows probably about maybe 2 feet high, with these beautiful fluffy white flower, purple flowers, sorry, almost like an ageratum if anyone's growing floss flower in their gardens. This was, again, in the top 10 plants we wanted to see, was Cypripedium calceolus. Most of the plants were finished. We found one spot that still had one plant that was sort of still somewhat photographic or photogenic. Most of the plants were already gone past their peak by the time we found them. But it was interesting to sort of look at the difference between Cypripedium calceolus and our native form, which is Cypripedium parviflorum. A couple of other orchids, new ones for the day, was Platanthera bifolia and Platanthera chlorantha. These two look very, very similar. Essentially, the only difference was the length of the nectar spore, the nectar spur off the back of the plant. Maybe the subtle differences in the shape of the lip. It's sort of like looking at our Platanthera huronense versus Platanthera aquilonis. You know, the difference between those two orchids is very subtle. The same with these two Platantheras in the Swiss Alps. Very, very subtle difference between the two. Now we did find another rhododendron here on this day. This is Rhododendron hirsutum, very similar to Ferruginium. The main difference is if you look in this picture right here, you can see that the edges of the leaves have this little eyelash. Okay, they are hirsute, these little stiff hairs. So Ferruginium has no hairs on the leaves. Hirsutum has a very, very fine fringe of hairs on the edge of the leaf. Not surprisingly, in areas where these two species overlap, you get a lot of hybrids between the two. Okay, the next day we went to the Lauterbrunnen Valley and the Stabach Falls. So this is down right here. So we had to take the train from Wengen down to the bottom of the valley here. And we hiked then up the middle of this valley right here. And it's sort of around where my mouse is right now. That's where the Stabach Falls are. And those falls originate from the glaciers up here in the Jungfraujoch area. Now we're way below the tree line now. We're into the forest, into a very agricultural area. So lots of meadows, lots of cattle in this area. So it was sort of a cloudy day. It started to rain late in the day, but it was just sort of to give us a bit of appreciation of some of the more rural areas where people would live. Now, I should note that because there's no traffic to take goods up into Wengen and some of the other little communities in the mountains there, they actually had to bring all their goods in by train. So we'd hop on a train to go from point A to point B, and someone could bring in, 2 or 3 big boxes of fresh produce, or 2 or 3 boxes of cut flowers or potted flowers, and they'd be brought to the supermarkets up in Wengen. So, it was a very interesting way. And if they didn't bring it by train, they brought it up by helicopter. And even if you built a new home, you had to get all your materials for the houses helicoptered up. It must cost a fortune to do that, but there's no way to get all the materials up there otherwise. So, when we were out hiking, we're in the background, we're constantly hearing way off in the distance, not enough to bother you, but you would see helicopters coming up out of the valleys and going back down into the valleys again. So this is the Stabach Falls. Excuse me. I should have taken a glass of water with me. And the Stabach Falls actually had caves. You could actually go into the caves and see the falls sort of dropping down in amongst the caves. It was actually quite spectacular to see this. But again, all limestone. So the rivers here basically erode through the limestone relatively easily. And this was actually a cemetery. And it was really almost like a botanical garden. It was absolutely gorgeous. All these beautifully pruned shrubs. Most of the headstones were made out of local stone. Many of them dated back 100 years. But it was like, it's just the most gorgeous, really, for a graveyard. It was, we spent like an hour wandering around here, looking at the headstones, looking at all the beautiful flowers. It really was a park for all intents and purposes. This was an interesting bit of architecture or art. It was basically river rocks, sort of washed river rocks that were all cemented together to form this great big huge ball. So I thought it was rather picturesque, actually. This was a little kitchen garden from one of the little places. And what was interesting, to separate the various beds, they used indoor-outdoor carpet. And it's something I never would have thought of using. Around here, we use wood chips or a bit of straw, but indoor-outdoor carpet can work as well. Okay, it keeps the weeds down, certainly in the trails. So you can see a wide variety. And this was at the end of June. You can see just how far advanced the vegetables were at that stage. So I thought it was worthwhile to take pictures of these little gardens. It was almost inspirational, really, of what we can do around here. And this is a dung pile, okay? It's a pile of cow poop. And what you're seeing here are squash and pumpkin, okay? So they'd have their dung pile, their compost pile, and they plant the pumpkins or the squashes right into the middle of the pile. And they would just cascade down over the top of that, use the compost for the food. And, by the end of the summer, you wouldn't even know the compost pile was there. It'd be just completely covered in vegetation. So again, something we could possibly think about doing in our own gardens. Okay, day 6. Day 6, we went to the Jungfraujoch. So this is what they call the top of Europe. And this is the day that we took the train to Kleine Scheidegg, went through the middle of this mountain and popped out on the glacier. Not a lot of flowers that day. Till later in the afternoon, we went back down and we went on the Eiger Trail, which was basically very, very close to, my mouse won't show up here now, but it's just to the left of the Kleine Scheidegg area. So this is the building at the top of the Jungfraujoch. So you take the train, you pop out onto this building, you can wander around there, and from that building, you can see it's very touristy. That's probably where I caught COVID, because I did catch COVID on that trip. And this is the view, looking back down into the valley. So we were, we were hiking way down in the green areas down at the bottom there. And this was a glacier. And you can actually walk out across the glacier. But keeping in mind, this glacier may not exist in 10 years' time. So we all had to wear our sunglasses here. The sky was just brilliantly blue, as you can see. And the sun reflecting off that snow was just brutal to the retinas. And people would come up here in helicopter, you know, in a helicopter would do tours over the top of the glaciers. I'm sure it costs a fortune to do that. And then when we finished in the glaciers, we came back down, we then did the Eiger Trail. And here you can see another one of the gondolas. We actually went on that gondola a couple of days later. People will rock climb this rock face right here. This is the Eiger Mountain. And at the base of this mountain, there are lots of memorials to people who lost their lives while climbing this rock face. So it's not for the faint of heart. But the meadows here were just breathtaking. Oh my gosh, it was just mind-blowing, the variety of flowers that were growing on these steep embankments. But we saw more of the anemone or Anemonastrum narcissiflorum. We found more of the leopard's bane, the Dronacum grandiflorum, more Gentiana collis. Another Pedicularis, a new one, Pedicularis odori. Quite pretty. Ranunculus alpestris, which we've seen before, growing next to Hornugia alpina. And then the yellow here is Helianthemum alpestri. Some new saxifrages, Saxifraga androsacea and Saxifraga bryoides. And all this pink, I saw this off in the distance. I had to go to investigate because I couldn't figure out what in the heck it would be. And when I got down to the bottom of this little valley, it ended up being just a bed of Silenia collis. Again, a plant that we see up on the Northern Peninsula. And we had Salix herbacea. That's a plant extremely rare in Newfoundland. We're not even sure if it's actually on the island. I certainly saw it in Labrador, but people have looked for it in the Serpentine area south of St. Anthony in particular. And we had Saxifraga or Salix retusa, this little one right here, and Salix reticulata. So that's one that we see here in Newfoundland. Day 7, we went to the Scheinige Plata and their Alpine garden. So we went from Wengen, we took the train to Lauterbrunnen, we came on down to the Wilderswil, and then we took another gondola, a train, sorry, on up here to the Scheinige Plata over in this area. So there's a big valley in between Wengen and the Scheinige Plata. There they had a beautiful alpine garden, little gift shop, very touristy. And you can walk through the steps. All the flowers in the alpine garden were all labeled, but essentially it looked like an alpine meadow with beautiful little steps going through. Like I said, all these different flowers right here were all native plants that were all labeled. So it gave you a great opportunity to find out what in the heck it is you're looking at when you're out walking on the trails. And they had their own little scree garden created there. But then we left the alpine garden and we did a beautiful circular walk through the alpine zone. And we hiked right over to the base of this mountain right here. And we hiked around the base of this particular mountain. And here's our group walking the trail. And on the other side of this trail here was probably about a 500-foot drop. Again, not for the faint of heart. You didn't want to lean over the edge of that. You could get giddy very rapidly. And there's nothing there to stop you from falling because there's no fencing or anything there. So you had to be very, very cognizant of where in the heck you are. But again, the meadows were spectacular. The weather was spectacular. So here's the view from that little narrow place where all our group was walking, looking down into the valley. This is the Interlaken, the community of Interlaken, and there's two very, very large lakes here. So this is a community that basically exists between these two lakes. We actually took a boat ride the length of this lake to the very, very far end of it on another day. So just another view of the rock roses, the helianthemums, and the Conopsia orchid, and a Saxifraga paniculata, the encrusted saxifrage that were also growing along the ridge here, the ridge line. Campanula thursoides, another campanula, but with creamy white flowers. This is Erinus alpinus, and this is a monkshood called Aconitum vulparia. It's a pale yellow monkshood. And we're used to seeing monkshood in our gardens as being dark blue. Here's a closer view of that campanula. It's a biennial species. And here's a closer view of the Aconitum, the monkshood. Phytuma, hemisphericum, and Hidicerum hidiceroides. Okay, so we have Hidicerum alpina that grows on the Northern Peninsula, and this particular species of Hidicerum looks very, very similar to the alpinum. And there's a closer view of the Phytuma. And lots of yellow daisies. So there was Senecio doronicum. So it's the ragweed or ragwort that looks like a leopard's bane. There was Arnica montana, and there was Solidago vigaria. So this is a native goldenrod. It's the only native goldenrod in all of Europe. Now we have so many different goldenrods here in North America, but in Europe they only have one species, and it's quite a small one. Here's more of that orchid, the Tronstenera, but we actually found an alba form. So again, we got very excited to find a single plant that was in pure white. Day 8, we're getting closer to the end. We had 10 days. So this particular day, we went back up to the Winterreg area, so off to the right of the slide here, and another little place called the Almendubel. And again, in this case, we weren't really into the alpine zone. We were sort of on the fringe of the forest. So we're seeing a lot of woodland species here. But again, you know, you always were close to the subalpine, we'll say. That particular day was cloudy out most of the day. So you couldn't really see the mountains proper, but lots of cattle. It was sort of nice to hear their bells going. And of course, you know, Switzerland is famous for its cheeses and famous for its chocolate. And all that comes from the milk that's created by these dairy cattle that are high up in the mountains. So here's our group. That particular day was somewhat mozzy, but it was still relatively mild. Even though I was the only, I think it was only 2 of us that were in shorts that day. Here we were having our little lunch break. And here we saw a few new plants. We had Viola lutea. So this is a little yellow violet, very similar to the garden violas. A closer view there of the flower. And there's some variations. Some are pale yellow, some are deeper yellow. And on some of the little rocky outcrops, we had Sempervivum montanum. This is a hensenchick. Some of you may be familiar with those growing in your own garden. More Saxifraga paniculatus, the encrusted saxifrage, and Phytuma hemisphericum. And they were just growing as basically what was a large boulder along the side of the trail. In the meadows was more Arnica montana, Astrantia minor, very, very tiny. Those flowers there were only about the size of your pinky nail, really, really tiny. And a new gentian, Gentiana purpurea. And what you see is what you get. It's not the most picturesque of the gentians, but basically bumblebees would force their way down inside the flowers to get access to the nectar and the pollen. Campanula schuttzeri, Phytuma betenicifolium in the middle, and Lilium martagon. So I was delighted to see that. That was, again, in my top 10 plants that I wanted to see was the martagon lily. And we grow that here in our botanical garden. We grow it in the Heritage Garden, but it was so neat to see them growing in the wild. Very highly fragrant flowers. Here's the Phytuma. Creepus aurea. So sort of almost like our orange hawkweed that we grow here in Newfoundland, but a different species, the Creepus aurea. And Leucanthemum atratum. So that's basically a Shasta daisy, an oxeye daisy species, but a different species from what we have here. And quite small, only grows probably about 6 to 8 inches high. And there's a closer view of the Creepus aurea. Pyrola, we had a Pyrola intermedia, so a different species, a brand new species I've never seen before. The intermediate wintergreen. And another orchid, but an orchid I'm familiar with here in Newfoundland, Neotia cordata, the heartleaf twayblade. So it's sort of neat. It's a very, very small little orchid, as anyone who's ever seen it growing here in Newfoundland. It's a very tiny little thing, easily overlooked. But again, neat to see it growing in a completely different part of the world. More orchids, Dactylorhiza fuchsii, as we've seen before, but here we had a great variety. The typical form is the purple one with the darker veins, but we saw some that were very, very pale pink, and including ones that were pure white as well. Day 9. So day 9 now we went down to the Interlaken, the Brennersee, and the Brense Rothorn. So the Brennersee was the large lake, and we took the boat to the end of that lake. Then we took a train up to the Brense Rothorn area, up into the Alpine. Unfortunately, this is the day that it really rained all day, so it was a bit disappointing in that regards. This is the boat we went on. It was basically a paddle boat that took us the length of the lake. Quite pretty. Just a view out across the lake, looking at some of the little towns that were scattered all around the perimeter. So even though, you know, not necessarily it was every day botanizing, it was sort of nice to get out and see some of the community, do a boat ride. You know, it gave you a better appreciation of what Switzerland has to offer. This was an old monastery, which is now actually opened up as a museum. We never had an opportunity to go in there, unfortunately, but it dates back into, I think, the 1500s. And what's interesting in Switzerland, a lot of the buildings there are very old, 300 and 400 years old, but because they weren't involved in either of the world wars, because they were neutral, none of the old buildings were bombed, you know, so they lost a lot of the old buildings elsewhere in Europe. But here in Switzerland, all the old buildings are still completely intact. So it was pretty neat. We actually had lunch one day in a restaurant that was in a building that was 400 years old. I mean, it was absolutely amazing. And you can see, just like I said, it gives you how pretty the little towns are, with the houses sort of nestled on the hillsides. And this was a little train that we took then up to the top of the mountain there, to the Brense Rothorn, and that's at the top of the mountain. But here's the lake down the valley. At the bottom of that valley is where we picked up the train, and then we had to go climb. And eventually, as we went through the cloud layer, we went along this road or this train track, and then we circled back around, and we circled off the screen and came back around. And essentially it took an hour to get to the top of the mountain by the train. You could almost walk faster than what the train went, to tell you the truth. But it was, I mean, it was just, oh, I mean, it was just awe-inspiring, really, to see all this. So again, because it was raining that day, we were up above the cloud level. So they say the view here is spectacular. I can't argue, because I couldn't see it. But we actually went up above the cloud layer in this particular case. But it was raining, it was windy. We didn't stick around very long. Most of the people, and it was cold too, it was a cold day, still probably around 11 or 12 degrees. From my perspective, I found it quite comfortable. But for the rest of the people, they found it too cold and they wanted to go back down. So we didn't spend very much time here. So I snapped off a few very, very quick pictures. Astragalus australis, Erigeron uniflorus, and Minuartia verna were a couple of the new plants that we saw here. Veronica fruticans and Asplenium viride. Okay, so another plant is native here on the limestone barrens in Newfoundland. Okay, so day 10, this is our last day. This is the day we went to Grindelwald. So we went from Wengen up by train to Kleine Scheidegg, continuing on with train to Grindelwald. Then we got to gondola to a place called First, which is way over here. But again, the same mountain ranges were always in the background. Very, very popular with the tourists. And as a result, not so popular with us because we're just too much, there was just too many people around to really enjoy it. And you can see, because of the number of people that went up to the place called First, a lot of the alpine flowers were degraded. So it was a bit disappointing in that regards. but we managed to find one trail that was a little bit more challenging to walk on. So most of the tourists didn't take that trail, and we're able to see some really great plants as a result. So this was along that trail that was sort of getting away from where all the people were. This is the Grinderwald, is right down the bottom of the valley there. This is our view of the mountains. Again, just a beautiful sunny day. Another view here in the Alpine zone. And here were some of the plants that we saw when we got onto this little sort of secluded trail. Anthillis vulneraria, the kidney vetch, grows wild in Stephenville. Calthopalustris, marsh marigold. Most of us have seen that growing on the West Coast. And more of that Geum montanum. So lots of yellow in that area. The Gentiana vernas here were spectacular. Huge plants, 15, 20, 25 flowers per cluster, all at the peak of perfection. Intense blue. But then we saw some of these ice blue varieties, which were in their own right, very, very spectacular as well. And we found one that was almost white. It was such a pale blue. So it's great to see those. And in the top 10 was a second species of Soldanella. This is Soldanella pusilla. It's the smallest of all the Soldanellas. And again, it was growing on the edge of a late lying snowbed. So we're so happy to see this. Again, typically sort of a pale mauve, but we found a pure white one, and we found a couple that were more of that pinky purple color, which is absolutely exquisite little plant. This is the a view from the gondola, because from here, we took the gondola then from Grinderwald back up to the Kleine Scheidegg again, where we had to pop on the train to go back to Wengen. So this particular gondola, and we're on the gondola now looking down at the roofs of the houses. That gondola is, I think, a little over 2 kilometers in length. So it's amongst the longest gondolas in the world. And brand new, it only opened up a year ago. So it's quite spectacular to take the gondola. This was a new center where the gondola drops you off, all state of the art, all glass, all gorgeous building, a great cafe in there. On the back of it was even a hotel. But what we did is we wandered basically to the right of this building. There was a scree slope, and we had some spectacular plants on that scree slope. So here's the view. This is the scree slope we were walking on. Wengen, where we spent most of our time, where we stayed every night, is this little community perched on top of the cliff right here. Okay, so give you an appreciation of just where this community was located and the reason why there was no cars going to this particular community. So here we were on these scree slopes, all limestone, and we were seeing a new viola, Viola senecio. That's these little patches of blue, sort of bluey mauve. Here it is, the flower here. Very, very similar to calcarata, which we also saw on the trip on day 1. But calcarata always grew in the grassy meadows, whereas this one here, senecio, only grew on the limestone scree. Here you can see another little Viola biflora growing behind it. And we had Cerastium latifolium, one of the little alpine chickweeds. We had Veronica alpina, the blue here. We had Campanula cochlearifolia. We grow that one here in the botanical garden. This is a little Minuartia, a little sandwort growing below it. And we had Helianthemum alpestri. We had Oxytropis campestris. You might say, ooh, that looks nothing like what we have as campestris here in Newfoundland. Ours has purple flowers, which is the variety Johannensis or the variety Terra Novae. I'm still very dubious about calling ours a campestris, but you know I can't swear to it. The botanists, I'm going to assume, know what they're talking about. But it's interesting because I've seen Oxytropis campestris in the Rocky Mountains, and the ones in the Rockies are different again from the ones that were in Switzerland, which are different again from the ones that grow here in Newfoundland. The purple flowered one here is Oxytropis jacquinii. And we'll end it off. This is our group. Very happy. This is on the back deck of our hotel. The beautiful valley here in the back. This is the valley that we hiked up through, the Lottobrunnen Valley, to the waterfall, which was at the very end of that valley. The Silberthorn, where the 007 was on the other side of this mountain range up here, and then the Kleine Scheidegg was on the other side of the mountain over here. So just sort of to bring it back to reality as to where we were. So it was a great group. There was myself, this lady back right here was the other co-leader, and then these were all members of the North American Rock Garden Society that came along on the trip. So with that, I say thank you. And at this stage, are there any questions?
Well, I don't have a question right now, Todd, but I certainly want to thank you because that was fabulous. That was just, the colors of those plants were beyond. From the darkest blue to the whites that you don't expect to be white. That was just wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. I can honestly say, of all the botanical places I've been, I don't think I've ever seen such a rich flora as what's in the Swiss Alps. I'm sure there are other places in the world, but it was just such a huge concentration of so many varieties of plants in such a small area. It really was mind-blowing.
I agree, Todd. Of all the presenters we've had since I've been a member, I don't remember seeing that many flowers in one slideshow. No doubt about it. It's just, I'm gobsmacked, to be honest.
And I never showed you everything. I mean, I had to be a bit selective. I mean, really, it was like I said, I think I had pictures of like close to 300 species of plants. You know, it really was crazy, absolutely crazy at the end of the day, trying to sort through all the pictures.
I have to say the ranunculus, the pink and white ranunculus, and that's absolutely.
Oh, those buttercups. I mean,
Yes.
all these white buttercups in the mountains. I mean, there were 3 species, and they were all absolutely exquisite as far as a buttercup is concerned.
One other question, you know, I know you're going, you know, you're being transported, but for hiking around, it seems like you're up at a high level. How do most of the people with you find climbing that height? Was it difficult?
Yeah, as it turned out, because the critical point is around 8,000 feet. Okay, so if you can stay under 8,000 feet, most people generally don't find it too bad as far as elevation is concerned. If you're going to suffer from altitude sickness or really get short of breath, it's generally above 8,000 feet. And most of the time we were just below that level. So most of the people had no problems at all. I think there were 2 ladies that were up in their 80s. Then on a couple of the more steeper trips, we basically said, you know, as the guides, we suggested they not come, that they sort of linger on the bottom, and we would catch up to them like in hours or, you know, hour, 2 hours time. And once they spoke to the other people, at the time they were a bit disappointed, but when they spoke to the rest of the clients afterwards, they said, you know, they were appreciative that we told them that they shouldn't have come. And you know, so, you know, if you have either bit of a problem at all, then it might be a little bit of a challenge. Most of these people were, you know, quite healthy and hale, and didn't have any problems. There was one gentleman that was a bit, I don't want to be cruel and saying he was a bit of a klutz, but he did have a tendency to fall all over the place. And I mean, every day he was falling down, and one day he fell down and cut his leg, and actually had to get back on the train, go back to Wengen, and go to a hospital there and get 10 stitches. So that was not good, but the next day he was out hiking again. So he was a glutton for punishment, but he seemed like he enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thanks, Todd.
Todd, can I 2 basic questions? I forget, what time of year were you there?
That was the last 10 days of June.
Okay, and the other thing is, the gondolas are used for tourists primarily, or are they the way that people get from village to village?
Primarily, it's for the tourists. Most of the people getting from village to village would have taken the trains. Right, so all the goods and services would be transported by train. Basically, the gondola was for the hikers. Okay, so it was a quick way to get the hikers from the communities up into the high Alpines areas. Now, I should also note that Wengen is actually more famous for its skiing than anything else. Okay, it's the ski capital, one of the ski capitals of Switzerland. So even though while we were there in June, we thought there were a lot of people around, it's nothing. It's like 10% of the people that turn up there in the winter. Okay, so in the winter, you're tripping up over people. You know, so if you're a skier, you might want to avoid it because there's just so many people there. But, you know, from a botanical point of view, it was a great opportunity to sort of get away from the crowds for the most part, other than a few people that were, real avid hikers that would spend a lot of their summers hiking around these trails, because there was literally hundreds of kilometers of trails traversing these mountains. It's just mind-boggling, again, the number of hiking trails that exist up here.
So when would all of this infrastructure been put in? Because prior to that, I assume they would have been rural, bringing their goats and cows up to the mountains, and it would have been little
Yeah,
roads.
well,
When
certainly
did this change?
I suspect that a lot of these gondolas all went in within the last 20 to 30 years. And in fact, I mean, we were on a brand new gondola. I went from Grindelwald back up to the Kleine Scheidegg, which had only opened up last year. So they're still putting in new infrastructure into these areas. So obviously, you know, if you got the tourist dollars going in there and you can afford it, it doesn't seem like Switzerland's in want of a dollar. By any stretch of the imagination. You know, it seems like people are quite wealthy. It had to be one of the cleanest places I've ever been. I mean, I never saw a stick of chewing gum or chewing gum itself on any of the sidewalks in any of these places. I swear you can eat off the floor or eat off the roads. It was absolutely amazing how clean Switzerland is.
And of course,
Any
they
of
don't
these
have to pay
areas
any money.
protected? Sorry.
So
They don't
So
have to pay any money for armaments for any world wars. They have a bit of spare money.
yeah, a little bit of extra money there for certain. So Susan, you asked another question there.
Is any areas protected in that we're trying to protect, you know, land around here, which we think is important? Are they protecting any? So it's not going to be tourists
Right.
all over it?
The area that we were in was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but at no point did I see anything saying, you know, that it was actually protected. Now, it might be protected, but if it is protected, there's an awful lot of footpaths, and there's no one stopping you from walking off the footpaths if you so desire. So I have the feeling that the area itself is not really protected, not to the same degree as what some of our national parks will be concerned. Now, having said that as well, I never saw any evidence of people digging anything up, right? So there may very well be laws in place to prevent you from digging up any of the wildflowers that are there. But again, I can't swear to it. I never saw any reference one way or the other.
So how many plants did you sneak home with you?
I took home nothing. Mind you, if I had been there in August, there would have been a lot of seeds jump in my pocket, I can assure you. But there are, you know, fairly stringent laws about importing things into Canada from overseas. So I never bothered to take the risk.
Todd, I noticed that there was one bee, I think it could have been a wasp, but otherwise mostly the few pollinators that I saw look like flies. Did you see many or any bees?
Most of the bees, we only saw one species of bumblebee high up in the mountains. It was fairly common. There were lots of syrphid flies, lots of drone flies in the area. And I'm sure there were probably lots of little solitary bees, but you know, you have a tendency to sort of to ignore those because they're relatively small. And you may just sort of palm them off as being a little fly, you know, a nondescript little fly. But there's certainly lots of evidence of flowers being visited. I mean, there's so many flowers up there. They're all brightly colored. Hence, they had to be pollinated by insects that use color as a guide. We saw a few butterflies, not a lot of butterflies in that area. So I suspect that most of the pollinators were indeed flies and or different types of bees.
Any other questions? You know, you have to unmute yourself if you want to speak up.
Todd,
We
I
have
have a
several-
question.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead, Kathy.
Todd, did you see any birds?
We surprisingly not very many. Up in the high alpine areas we were too, we would see the same birds every day. So, so we saw, European blackbirds. We had some the Eurasian nuthatches, Eurasian nutcrackers, alpine choughs were everywhere every day. Ravens, which we see here, of course. And there was a couple of specialty alpine species, but we didn't spend much time in the lowland areas where I'm sure that's where probably more of the birds exist. So my bird list for up there was probably only about 20 species. So really not the place to go for bird watching.
Okay, thank you.
On the last few pictures, the Solendella, that.
Soldanella.
Yeah, and you're going to say no to me. Is that in any way related to the twin? Like when I looked at that, it looked like our twin flower.
No,
It's
it's
got that
actually,
look of, no,
no, it's related to primroses.
really?
Yeah,
Wow.
surprisingly enough.
Got
it's
that
in the
little bell
primrose
shape
family.
like the twin flower, but it's
Yeah,
beautiful too.
Yeah. Well, I got, really our twin flower is quite exquisite too when you see it close up. But these alpine fringe bells, the soldanellas, are just absolutely gorgeous. And they're all native throughout Europe. There's, I think there's around 10 to 12 species. I've seen 4 species now in the wild. Maybe I should use that as my bucket. Is to see all the species of soldanella of the world.
Gorgeous.
It will at least get me to the alpine zones because they only occur on the edges of these snow beds.
Beautiful though.
Well, I guess that we should probably clue up and, just say thank you again, Todd, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation tonight. You can see
You're
some of
very
the
welcome.
comments too.
I-
They all
I-
say thank you.
I
Spectacular,
relish the
fabulous.
chance to show them off.
Yes, I hope you let your mom watch this presentation that you've done. She can
Oh,
see where
yes.
you were.
Yeah. Todd, we have a little gift coming your way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Just
Thank
one last comment from me.
Yeah.
It's done.
I said this earlier, but since some more people have turned up, get sorting your pictures now for the annual slideshow and send them in to me by the end of, I think it's the 1st of December, I said. And I look forward to seeing lots more pictures. Thank you.
Okay, sure, John. Thank you. Thanks
Night.
again, Todd, and
Thank
you,
good night,
Malcolm.
everybody.
Thanks,
you all for
Karen.
Thank you very
coming.
much.
That's great. Okay.
Yeah, take care,
Bye-bye,
guys.
everyone.
Yeah,
Okay, everyone. We'll see you next
Thank you,
month.
Karen.
yeah, thanks.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Karen.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Thank you.